that our summers are getting hotter. Someone said to me a few weeks ago that this might be the coolest summer that we ever experience. I don't know about that, but it was an interesting idea. And we know that hurricanes like Ian are becoming more frequent, but today we're thinking more personally. We're not going the big global dread and anxiety that comes with thinking of climate change, but we're coming back home a little bit. We're taking this topic out of our heads and where we turn the idea into fuel for our anxiety, or we bury the idea. We don't even want to think about it because it's too overwhelming. But on this Yom Kippur, we are going to begin the conversation in our sacred space so that we might learn from each other and figure out how we are all handling it. When we do that, we can join together as a collective and try to make change. I offered a few examples of places where new technology, new ideas are actually making a difference. And when we join together, we also, as a community, might have the opportunity to make a difference. I'm going to turn it over to Arlene, who's going to talk to us a little bit about RAC California and what these conversations are about, and then we'll turn it over to our panelists.
So we were inspired to choose this topic for our conversations today by the fact that the Religious Action Center of California, or RAC California, has launched a climate tzedek, or climate justice campaign. For the next 2 to 3 years, Reform congregations across California are going to be working on how we can promote just science-based solutions to the climate crisis. And we're starting by having conversations in our congregations like the one that we're going to have today. We're going to start by hearing from our 3 panelists who will share their personal stories. And then afterward, we're going to break up into small groups and have an opportunity to all share our own stories on how we are personally impacted by climate change. Having conversations like this is part of something that's called relational organizing, which means building relationships among a group of people who have similar concerns so that they're empowered to make changes that benefit all of them. When we open up and share stories about things that truly matter to us, we get to know each other on a deeper level, we feel more connected, and that makes our congregation stronger. We're transformed from a group of people who just happen to attend the same synagogue into a community that will show up for one another. And frankly, that would be enough reason to have these conversations all by itself. Just that strengthening of our ties, that increasing our connections to one another, that's a worthy goal in and of itself. But as Rabbi Delson said, we had a subtitle for these conversations, Overcoming Our Feelings of Powerlessness. So we have to live up to that promise. We have to show how these conversations are actually going to make us empowered to do something about climate change. So how's that going to happen? Well, there's in a couple ways. First of all, as I said, when we share with one another on a deep level, we feel more connected, and then that makes us a community that fights for one another. There are a lot of issues in the world that I care about, but when it's something that touches someone who means a lot to me, I'm a lot more motivated to do something about it. And so when we learn that the impact that climate change is having on all of us, it's going to increase our motivation to work on it. But second, by hearing each other's stories of how they're personally impacted by climate change, we'll learn that we're not alone. There's been some survey-based research conducted by the Yale School of the Environment that reveals a really interesting paradox. While the vast majority of Americans are personally concerned about climate change and support major climate mitigation policies, I think Rabbi Delson alluded to that in her sermon, there's another belief that goes along with it, which is that most people erroneously believe that most other Americans are not that concerned about climate change and do not support mitigation policies. And so this mismatch between our personal concern and our belief about what other people think leads to a cycle of collective self-silencing on the topic of climate change and to decisions not to take action to call for mitigation policies. So by sharing these stories with one another, we're going to break that cycle. We're going to understand just how deeply all of us are feeling impacted. So even if we all care deeply about it, though, and even if we know that we all care deeply about it, how does that empower us to make difference, to make change? Again, Rabbi Delson talked about this a little bit in her sermon, but I just want to take it just a step further. During the launch of this RAC California Climate Set It campaign, we heard from our own state senator, Josh Becker, who's really active in the state legislature on climate issues. And he said something that was so eye-opening to me and so empowering that it completely changed the way I view my role in the climate issue. He said, and Rabbi Delson said this too in her sermon, that we actually have the technology that we need to address the climate crisis. What we don't have is the political will. And political will is us. Political will comes from us. It's us telling our policymakers that we want them to do something. And the more of us who stand up and do that, who tell them that, the more courage they will have to stand up to special interests like the fossil fuel industry, and the more motivation they will have to enact climate mitigation policies. So that's what our conversations are all about today, building relationships and building our power.
Thank you so much, Arlene. So now we are going to get to, these are for the conversation leaders, thank you. Now we're going to hear from our own congregants, and they have had the chance to think a little bit about the answer to the question, how have you been personally impacted by climate change? And so they're each going to answer in their own way. Some of the stories will sound familiar, similar to each other, and others will be very different. And the idea is that we all have these stories, and not everyone's stories will be the same, and not everyone's stories will be completely different. And so they are thank you to Nick Akers, Ellie Feeder, and Stella Wetton for sharing their stories with us, being very brave and offering what is sometimes quite private and sometimes quite scary to talk about with other people, because we don't know how other people think or if they're on the same level as us when we're wondering about this issue. So that quote, Arlene, that statistic was really, really helpful. Okay. Now, I'm going to pass the mic over to Stella, who's going to begin for us. Stella is one of our teens in our congregation. She goes to Burlingame High School, and we're delighted to have you. Thanks, Stella.
Scientists count just 5 mass extinctions in an unimaginably long expanse of 450 million years. But they warn we may well be entering a 6th. According to a bold new paper in the Anthropocene Review, this time would be different from past mass extinctions in several ways, and all of these stem from the impact of a single species that arrived on the scene just 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, says Jeremy Hans. As a community that benefits from the availability of resources that improve our resilience towards the impacts of the climate crisis, we often turn our heads to the urgency of the situation. Even so, many of us have been witnessing the consequences of this issue for as long as I can remember. I can still recall September 9th, 2020, the day we all woke up to an orange hue illuminating our bedroom walls through our bedroom windows. These orange skies were a phenomenon that resulted from the convergence of fog and wildfire smoke. Both climate change and human intervention with forced natural disturbance regime has exacerbated wildfires over the past century, an issue that has personally impacted everyone in this room. As teenagers, our perspectives are unique in the sense that this issue most severely impacts our futures. The question we must ask ourselves is not what we have done, but what can we do? American climate activist Farshini Prakash once said, "There always will be the fear of defeat, but there's also the knowledge that something is more important, a deep spiritual calling towards doing something to better people's lives, the lives of those we love and those we'll never meet." Mitigating the effects of the climate crisis necessitates both technological innovation and scientifically informed legislative change, a process that both the adults and the youth in this room have the capability to shape. The midterm elections are right around the corner, and I urge every adult in this room to vote because that is the most effective way to positively impact the climate change movement. But just because you cannot vote does not mean you do not still have the ability to influence the election. These changes will only become feasible once awareness and pressure to solve these issues are increased. Climate change is not just an important topic, it is an issue that calls for immediate action because it impacts everyone in this room as well as everyone who lives and breathes on Earth. I urge people to discuss with their peers about how this crisis impacts them personally and how it impacts people around the world. As Jews, we strive for tikkun olam, or to make the world a better place.
Thank you, Stella. That's great. So I'm gonna let everyone share their stories, and then we'll ask a question, and then we'll go into our breakout groups. So Ellie Feeder, graduate from the University of California, Davis, is now working in the Jewish community in San Francisco, and member for a long time here at PTS. Whatever. Okay. Very, very important member of our community. I was going to make some comment about you and your dad, but here we are. Okay. Ellie, we would love to hear your story.
Thank you. This summer, I graduated from college and got to experience a lot of fun things. I visited England during a record heat wave. I spent some time working at Camp Newman, post-destruction from a fire. I went on a camping trip in Southern Oregon where we were inundated by smoke from nearby fires. I moved out of my college house in Davis on a 110-degree day, and that is just the past 3 months. Now, all of this might sound a little apocalyptic to you, and don't get me wrong, it does very much for me too. But for so much of my life, I've lived in a state of existential dread, as legislation to address climate change seems to take 1 step forward and 3 steps back, and worsening flooding threatens people's homes. A state of feeling desperate at the world's inaction and paralyzed by my own. My generation often jokes, why invest in a 401k when there might not be enough land for crops to support the growing population in a few years? A couple of weeks ago, I officially joined America's working force and began the classic 9 to 5. I love my job, but I struggle with the fact that my passions don't lie in environmental work. I have my own career aspirations to make the world a better place, but what if it's not in the ways that matter most right now? Is that still valid? When Camp Newman was destroyed in a fire, it was heartbreaking that what felt like a second home to me was gone. This past weekend, I reunited with a couple of friends from that time, and we remarked that it was devastating to grieve. And then it only got worse, not just for people we knew and places we loved, but for people all around the world. I haven't figured out a way to feel okay about any of this, and I worry if having children is irresponsible. There are always existential threats, World War, asteroids, some years the Supreme Court. But in order to continue to function and aid society, I need to find my way through this angst. If not clear already, it's proving quite difficult for me. So I'll say this. I feel angry a lot of the time, and in my 22 increasingly warming years, I haven't figured out how to hold any of it. However, last night, as my dad and I, Rabbi Feeder, drove home from services together, I asked him how he manages to seem so happy so much of the time. After spending the past few weeks poring over High Holy Day liturgy, steeped in mortality, sins, the way we will die, and reckoning, he still remains a rather giddy person, comparatively. In hearing him talk about how the material sits with him, I realize that buoyancy can be found even in the heaviness. In the coming year, I hope for me, and for all of you as well, that instead of tiresome, climate activism could feel meaningful. Instead of feeling frustrated by the inaction of our leaders, we could feel resilient. Instead of dread, you might feel empowered. And personally, I would love to find a way to feel a little bit hopeful about it all too. Thank you.
Yasher koach, Ellie. Thank you so much. All right, and now we have Nick Akers, who is a new-ish member to our congregation and our community, and we're delighted to have him on the panel this afternoon.
Good afternoon. In 2017, I was sent by my work to Santa Rosa during and then immediately after the Tubbs fire. I had spent summers there with family when I was growing up. I had memories of learning to fish in Lake Ralphine, helping my parents pick apricots from trees that my great uncle had planted and cared for in the backyard of a family house. And my mom now owned that house, and while our family was safe, we'd been watching online as the fire lines and the evacuation zones got closer and closer to it. The house was on a flat city street, blocks from any wildland, not like here at PTS, where we're right across the street from Mills Canyon. But by then, we knew that this fire was different. It had swept across neighborhoods and even jumped a 8-lane interstate highway, so we knew that the house was at risk, and the risk was real. When I eventually got to Santa Rosa, I was struck by the devastation. We've all seen the photos, but it was stunning to stand in neighborhoods that had been completely burned to the ground and where people had lost their lives. I'd been in fire zones before, but the size, the scope of the devastation to the heart of a city was more than I'd ever seen. Our house was spared, but neighborhoods that I remembered as lush and vibrant had been reduced to smoldering rubble. And then there were the stories. I bumped into a friend who told the story of being awakened by sirens and loudspeakers in the middle of the night and fleeing with his wife and small children. As the fire kept spreading, they kept driving, and they eventually found their way at dawn to the beach miles away at Bodega Bay. Equally stunning, of course, were the helpers. I was surrounded by firefighters, including inmate fire crews, as well as police and sheriffs, National Guard soldiers, and other first responders from California and across our neighboring states. And they were there working together to help fight the fires, protect the community, care for the injured, support their local colleagues. The fairgrounds, which for me had been ironically filled with memories of fireworks and 4th of July celebrations, had been turned into a fire camp, a tent city now filled with crews and equipment from all over. And the shelters were filled, not just with victims of the fires, who were certainly there, but also, again, with helpers, with mental health workers, chaplains of all faiths, famous chefs who set up field kitchens to feed victims and responders alike, and workers helping victims apply for disaster loans, replace driver's licenses and birth certificates, file insurance claims, and otherwise help with the thousands of different parts of material recovery that they were just beginning. Fred Rogers taught us at times like this to look for the helpers, and it was important to do that. It collectively gave us the strength to get through what were very, very difficult days. But while it was important in the moment to look for helpers, doing so for too long can distract us from the need to address the root causes of fires, like the Tubbs fire, the Camp Fire the following year that destroyed the town of Paradise and took 85 lives, the CZU Lightning Complex fire that swept through our own Santa Cruz mountains, or the mosquito fire that's still burning in the Sierras, that's burned tens of thousands of acres and so far cost more than $100 million to fight. And to date has required the efforts of 1,372 firefighters and other disaster workers. There are a number of factors that contribute to fires, but science tells us that climate change has already led to an increase in wildfire season length, wildfire frequency, and burned area. Warmer springs, longer summer dry seasons, and drier soils and vegetations have made fires deadlier and harder to fight. And that's not a surprise to anyone who's lived through the last few years. The term fire season is now a charming anachronism that's been replaced by a year-round threat. And September 9th, 2020, that orange day that we've talked a lot about today, showed us that smoke from wildfires miles away could blot out the sun. And if it's this bad now, we know that further climate change will continue to increase the frequency, extent, and severity of fires that we and our children will face for years to come. As a parent, I'm struck by what that might mean for our children and for other future generations. How bad will the fires be? How many orange days will they face? We can't turn back the clock, but it's time to stop this from getting worse.
Ashika, thank you. So I said we were going to have a chance to ask questions, and I am going to apologize for that. It's Yom Kippur, and I'm sorry we're actually not going to do that because I really want a chance for everyone to get into their groups and think about their own stories. And so I thank you so much, the three of you, for answering the same question from a different perspective and being brave for our community of sharing your story. So I really, really appreciate it and thank each of you for your time ahead of time and for being here today. Yeah, they deserve an applause, sure. This topic is very heavy, and it is already a heavy day. We're already thinking of all these ways that we have done wrong in the past year and how we might do better. But today is also a day of action and a day of hope, that we have the tools in front of us to make a change personally and as a community. And so I thank you all for being here and participating in this, which seems heavy, but we have the chance to do something as a community. I'm going to turn it back over to Arlene, who's going to break us into our breakout groups. Yes?
Do we know who all the names of all the leaders are?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So everybody should have gotten a bright colored postcard when you came in that will tell you what group you're in. We didn't know how many people were going to be here, so there could be a few groups with 10 people and there could be a few groups with 3, but we'll try to make sure everyone has an equal number in their group. So we have Ed and Julie Krause are one group. Well, Ed Krause is one group. Mark Engel is another. Sandra Feeder, Neil Tandowski. Who am I missing? Oh, we have Danielle, Heidi, Arlene, and Sue. So now we have the chance to go into a breakout groups, and we can use this entire space here. A group can decide to go out into the courtyard or go into the meditation garden. And throughout these conversations, these storytelling, really, we want to make sure that you can tell a story. It's not about your opinions about the issue, but something how it affects you as an individual. And we have 25 minutes. How many?
I think 25 minutes.
25 minutes for these stories.
Yeah. So we'll have our leaders sort of raise their hands and just try to gather people around them and then lead you to a space where you can have your conversation. And once we're in our groups, depending on how big the group is, each person will have probably about 2 minutes to share a personal story the way our panelists already have modeled for us, a personal story about how you've been impacted by climate change. There will be a timekeeper. Don't be offended if the timekeeper cuts you off. We just want to make sure that everyone has a chance. And we're not asking you to share intimate or private details of your life, but we do want you to share a story that's personal to you, not just about your general alarm or concern over what you're seeing in the world, but something that's personal to you and your family. Because our purpose is to listen and share with one another. We're not here to advise each other, critique each other, or try to solve anybody's problems. We're just here to listen and share. And we will have a note taker in each group who won't be recording specific details of anyone's story, but just sort of capturing the headlines of what people are talking about. Because as we go through this process and as we continue our work on climate change, we're going to want to be able to tap into people's stories again, because stories are really powerful. So that's why we want to be able to record what we're hearing today. So I think that's it for the logistics. At the end of our time in our small groups, we'll all come back to gather again, and Rabbi Delson will tell us about more things that we can be doing.
Great, thank you. And to those of you who are on YouTube, we will see you later on. Okay, so if our conversation leaders could stand up. And so first we have, this is Danielle over here. So if you have a Danielle card, you can go along with Danielle. And if you know who your conversation leader is, you can just start to go over to them. Heidi is the black and white dress, Sue, the purple dress, Sandra Feeder is right here in the front, Neil Tandowski over there, Mark Engel, and Ed Krause. And if you did not get a card, and Arlene Rosenberg, and if you did not get a card, let me know, and I will guide you to a group. Did you get a card?
You all were really wonderful. today, obviously.